every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. In the heart of the American South, in the summer of 1932, a strange kind of hope arrived in Macon County, Alabama. It came in dusty government cars, driven by men in neat clothes, carrying clipboards and medical bags. For the sharecroppers and laborers of this impoverished, majority-black county, life was a daily struggle against poverty, malnutrition, and a host of ailments collectively known by a weary colloquial term, bad blood. It was a catch-all phrase for everything from anemia and fatigue to the more fearsome scourge of syphilis, a disease that silently plagued the region. So when these men from the United States Public Health Service, the PHS, arrived with a promise of free medical care, it felt like a miracle. They offered physical exams, hot meals on examination days, and even burial insurance, all for participating in a new government study. For hundreds of men, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. They were told they were finally being treated for their bad blood. They were given tonics and aspirin. Their ailments were noted. Their trust was earned. They became proud participants in what they knew only as the Miss Rivers Lodge, named for the compassionate local nurse who served as the study's liaison. But this lodge was built on a foundation of lies. The tonics were placebos. The exams were for observation only. And the most agonizing of the procedures, the painful spinal taps, were deceptively presented as a special free treatment. The men were not patients. They were specimens. The goal was not to cure them, but to watch them, to chart with cold scientific detachment the progression of syphilis as it ravaged their bodies, destroyed their minds, and led them to an early, agonizing death. And when a cure, a true miracle drug called penicillin, became the global standard of care a decade later, the men of the Tuskegee study were not given it. Instead, the doctors who had sworn an oath to do no harm actively conspired to ensure they never received it. This is not a story of a crime that happened in a single, violent moment. It is the story of a crime that unfolded in slow motion over 4 decades. It was a crime committed not by a lone sociopath, but by a sprawling government bureaucracy, by generations of doctors and nurses who looked into the eyes of their fellow human beings and chose to see only data points on a chart. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a medical betrayal. We will explore how racial prejudice and scientific ambition fused to create one of the most infamous and unethical studies in human history, and how its discovery shattered the trust between a community and the very institutions meant to protect it. To understand how such an atrocity could begin, we must first understand the world from which it grew. Macon County, Alabama in the early 1930s was a place left behind by the 20th century. It was the heart of the old Cotton Belt, a rural landscape of tenant farms and unpainted shacks where the promises of emancipation remained largely unfulfilled. The Great Depression had fallen like a hammer on an already fragile economy. 60% of the families in the county were tenant farmers, trapped in a cycle of debt peonage. The average income was less than $1 a day. Illiteracy was rampant, with more than half the population having less than a 6th-grade education. In this environment, healthcare was a distant luxury. There were no hospitals for black residents, and the few doctors available were often too expensive or too far away. Disease festered. Pellagra, tuberculosis, and hookworm were common. And so was syphilis. A 1929 study by the philanthropic Julius Rosenwald Fund, aimed at improving the health of Southern African Americans, surveyed Macon County and found a staggering rate of syphilis infection. An estimated 35% of the black population had the disease. Syphilis at the time was a terrifying diagnosis. In its primary stage, it might present as a simple sore. In the secondary stage, a rash. But then it could lie dormant for years, a silent passenger, before re-emerging in its tertiary stage with devastating consequences: blindness, paralysis, severe heart problems, crippling joint damage, neurological decay, insanity, and eventual death. The Rosenwald Fund, in partnership with the Public Health Service, decided to act. Their initial project was a demonstration in good faith. They would go to Macon County, test the population, and treat those infected with the best available methods of the day. The treatments were brutal: a toxic cocktail of arsenic and mercury compounds called salvarsan and bismuth, administered through painful injections over the course of many months. The side effects were severe, and the cure rate was low, perhaps only 30%. But it was the only hope available, and it was a genuine effort to heal. They conducted this treatment program for about 2 years. Then, the stock market crash of 1929 rippled outward, and by 1932, its effects were strangling government and philanthropic budgets. The Rosenwald Fund pulled its funding. The Public Health Service was left with a choice. They could abandon the project entirely, or they could salvage something from the data they had already collected. It was at this juncture that a handful of men, sitting in offices far from the red dirt of Macon County, made a decision that would forever stain the reputation of American medicine. The head of the PHS Venereal Disease Division at the time was Dr. Taliaferro Clark. He saw a unique, if macabre, opportunity. A previous study in Oslo, Norway, had followed the progression of untreated syphilis in white men, but it was retrospective, relying on old hospital records. Dr. Clark and his colleagues envisioned something more thorough. What if they could watch the disease unfold in real time, in a living laboratory? The poor, uneducated, and now untreated black men of Macon County were, in his view, the perfect subjects. In a letter, he proposed what he called a never-to-be-repeated opportunity to study the effects of untreated syphilis on the Negro male from inception to death, culminating in a final autopsy to confirm the disease's pathology. The study's most enthusiastic champion was Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr, who would eventually take over as its on-site director. Vonderlehr was an ambitious PHS officer who saw the Tuskegee project as a path to professional acclaim. He and his colleagues rationalized their decision with a series of deeply racist and scientifically baseless assumptions. They argued that black men were constitutionally different from white men, that their cardiovascular systems were more susceptible to the disease, while their central nervous systems were somehow more resistant. They also operated under the paternalistic and cynical belief that these poor, uneducated men would never seek or complete the arduous treatment on their own anyway. So observing them in their natural, untreated state was causing no additional harm. It was a self-serving logic that redefined non-intervention as a valid scientific method, conveniently ignoring the fact that they had just spent 2 years actively treating this very population. And so, the study was reborn with a new secret purpose. It was officially titled The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The search for a cure was over. The death watch had begun. To launch this new phase, the PHS needed to recruit a large cohort of men. They enlisted the help of the prestigious Tuskegee Institute, a beacon of African American education and progress founded by Booker T. Washington. The Institute's involvement lent the project an invaluable air of legitimacy and trust within the community. They also hired a local African American nurse named Eunice Rivers. Nurse Rivers would become the enduring face of the study for the men who participated. For nearly all of its 40 years, she was the constant link between the government doctors and the community. She was a figure of immense complexity. To the men, she was a trusted caregiver. She drove them to their appointments, knew their families, brought them food, and listened to their troubles. She was their advocate, the one who ensured they received their small stipends and the promise of burial insurance. Yet, she was also the primary instrument of the study's deception. She knew the men were not being treated for syphilis. She knew the tonics were placebos. She facilitated the spinal taps, coaxing men to endure the painful procedure by framing it as a necessary part of their treatment. Her role has been debated for decades. Was she a willing accomplice, a victim of the same coercive system, or something in between? What is certain is that without the trust she engendered, the study could not have lasted for 40 years. The recruitment process was chillingly effective. The PHS sent out letters with imposing letterheads promising last chance for special free treatment. They initially enrolled 600 men, 399 who had latent syphilis, and a control group of 201 who were uninfected. The men were never told they had syphilis. They were only ever told they had bad blood, and they were never, ever told that the study's purpose was to watch them die. The initial phase of the research focused on documenting the physical toll of the disease. The men were subjected to regular physicals and blood tests, but the centerpiece of the early study was the spinal tap. A lumbar puncture is an invasive, painful procedure where a long needle is inserted into the lower back to draw cerebrospinal fluid. It's used to diagnose neurosyphilis, the stage where the disease attacks the brain and spinal cord. The PHS doctors wanted this data, but they knew no one would volunteer for such a frightening procedure without a powerful incentive. So they lied. They sent the 399 infected men a misleading letter that read, "Some time ago, you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you have gotten a great deal of benefit from the treatments. We are now writing you to let you know that we are coming around again for a follow-up. This examination is a very special one, and we hope you will take advantage of this opportunity, as it may be the last time we can offer you this service." The spinal tap was pitched as the special treatment itself. The deception worked. Overwhelmingly, the men agreed. The pain they endured was simply the price of the cure they so desperately wanted. As the 1930s wore on, the study became institutionalized. The data was collected, papers were published in prestigious medical journals, and the careers of the doctors involved advanced. Dr. Vonderlehr and others presented their findings at conferences, referring to their subjects not as people, but as an unusually rich collection of material. They documented the higher rates of cardiovascular damage and the lower, though not absent, rates of neurosyphilis, reinforcing their initial racial hypotheses. All the while, the men in Macon County grew sicker. Their bodies bore the brutal testimony of the disease the doctors were so keen to observe. Aortas weakened and ruptured. Joints swelled and seized up. Men went blind. They suffered from syphilitic psychosis, a dementia-like state as the spirochetes burrowed into their brains. And still, the study continued, its architects secure in their belief that they were conducting important work. They were so committed to maintaining the purity of their experiment, keeping their subjects untreated, that they actively worked to prevent the men from receiving care from other sources. They compiled a list of the 399 participants and shared it with local doctors and the Alabama State Health Department, with explicit instructions that these men were part of a special study and were not to be given treatment for syphilis. The betrayal was not passive, it was an active, ongoing conspiracy. Then came World War II. The draft swept across America, and nearly 250 of the men in the Tuskegee study were called up for military service. The standard Army physical included a blood test for syphilis. When the men tested positive, the Army's protocol was clear: treat them before they could be deployed. For the researchers in Tuskegee, this was a crisis. A mass treatment of their subjects would ruin their long-term data, so the Public Health Service intervened at the highest levels. They pulled strings with the Selective Service System. They provided the local draft board in Macon County with a list of their subjects, and an agreement was reached. The men of the Tuskegee study would be excluded from service, and thus denied the treatment the Army would have provided. The study was deemed more important than the health of the men, more important even than their service to the country during a world war. But the greatest moral test, and the study's most unforgivable sin, was yet to come. In the mid-1940s, the world of medicine was revolutionized by the mass production of penicillin. The new antibiotic was hailed as a miracle drug. It was stunningly effective against a range of bacterial infections, and it was particularly potent against the syphilis spirochete. For the first time in history, there was a safe, fast, and reliable cure for the disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. By 1947, penicillin was the universally accepted standard of care for syphilis. PHS-sponsored clinics were set up across the country to dispense the drug and wipe out the disease. The irony was grotesque. The very organization conducting the Tuskegee study was simultaneously leading the national charge to eradicate syphilis with penicillin. The availability of a definitive cure should have ended the Tuskegee study immediately. Ethically, there was no longer any justification, however flimsy, for withholding treatment. The men in Macon County could have been cured. Their suffering could have been ended. Their lives could have been saved. But the doctors in charge of the study made a conscious, deliberate choice. Their experiment was not complete. They had followed the men from infection into middle age. They still needed to follow them to the autopsy table. The allure of their unique data set was too strong. So the deception deepened. Not only did they continue to withhold penicillin from the 399 men, they intensified their efforts to prevent them from getting it elsewhere. They knew that as the drug became more common, the risk of their subjects being contaminated with a cure grew higher. Dr. John Heller, who took over the PHS Venereal Disease Division in 1943, was a staunch defender of the study. He and his colleagues rationalized their decision by arguing that the men were now in the latent stage of syphilis, and that penicillin might be less effective or even harmful to them, a claim not supported by mainstream medical evidence, which showed penicillin was still beneficial in preventing further progression of the disease. The conspiracy to deny treatment was meticulous. Physicians in the PHS maintained contact with doctors throughout Alabama, reminding them not to treat the study participants. When one of the men, Freddie Lee Tyson, was diagnosed with syphilis at a clinic in Birmingham and began penicillin treatment, Tuskegee researchers tracked him down. A PHS doctor personally wrote to his physician, explaining that Tyson was part of a special study and asking that he not be given any further therapy. The local doctor complied. The treatment was stopped. The researchers were not merely observing, they were enforcing their sentence of disease upon these men. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the study continued its quiet, ghoulish work. The original doctors, like Vonderlehr, retired and were replaced by a new generation who inherited the project without question. It had become an institution, a self-perpetuating machine. Papers continued to be published. The study was presented at medical conferences. In 1964, a major paper was published summarizing the mortality rates, noting that the death rate for the infected men was twice as high as that of the control group. The medical community at large, it seems, remained silent. No one questioned the ethics of a study that was, by this point, openly admitting to observing untreated subjects for over 30 years in an era with a simple, effective cure. But within the public health service itself, the first cracks in the wall of silence were beginning to appear. In 1965, a young PHS venereal disease investigator in San Francisco named Peter Buxton was assigned to a desk job. While sorting through paperwork, he came across medical journal articles describing the Tuskegee study. He was 27 years old, a product of the civil rights era, and he was horrified. He couldn't believe what he was reading. A long-term, non-therapeutic study on human beings, withholding a known cure. He was certain it had to be a relic from a darker time, a study that had long since been terminated. When he discovered it was still ongoing, he was profoundly shocked. Buxton decided he had to do something. He began by working within the system. In November of 1966, he wrote a letter to Dr. William Brown, the director of the Venereal Disease Division, expressing his grave moral and ethical concerns. He wrote, "The men's status has not changed since 1932. They are not being treated. The excuses for not treating the survivors are lame. I believe the PHS is violating the basic rights of these people." His letter set off a quiet debate within the halls of the PHS and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, which had by then absorbed the Venereal Disease Division. The study's defenders trotted out the same old justifications. The men were too old, the disease too advanced for penicillin to do any good. Treating them now wouldn't reverse the damage already done. And most importantly, the study was not yet complete. They still hadn't autopsied enough of the subjects to draw their final conclusions. The value of the scientific data, they argued, outweighed the ethical concerns. Buxton was not satisfied. He wrote another, more forceful letter in 1968. He pointed out the changing ethical landscape of medicine, citing the Nuremberg Code established after World War II, which explicitly forbade medical experiments on human subjects without their informed consent. He called the Tuskegee study an anachronism and implored his superiors to end it. His persistence did lead to an internal review. In 1969, the CDC convened a blue ribbon panel to decide the fate of the study. The panel consisted of 5 men, all white, all from outside the CDC. They reviewed the evidence, listened to the arguments from the study's directors, and came to a stunning conclusion. The Tuskegee study should continue until all the original subjects had died and been autopsied. Their recommendation was to make a renewed effort to ensure none of the men received penicillin. The institutional inertia, the moral blindness, was absolute. The system had investigated itself and found no wrongdoing. For Peter Buxton, it was a devastating blow. He had trusted the system to correct itself, to recognize the profound wrong it was committing. But the system had failed. He felt he had no choice left. He resigned from the public health service, his conscience unable to bear complicity. But he did not forget. For the next few years, he weighed his options. He knew that if he went public, he would be betraying the confidence of his former employer. But if he stayed silent, he would be betraying the men in Macon County. In 1972, he finally made his decision. He contacted a friend who worked as a reporter for the Associated Press, and she put him in touch with a young investigative journalist in the Washington Bureau named Jean Heller. Buxton told Heller the story. At first, she was incredulous. It sounded too monstrous to be true. A 40-year government experiment on poor black men withholding a cure for a deadly disease, it seemed impossible in modern America. Heller began to dig. She went to the CDC and the PHS, requesting the records of the study. The officials, perhaps not realizing the implications of what they were sharing, gave her access to the published papers and internal reports. The documents confirmed everything Buxton had told her. The evidence was all there, in black and white, in the dry, bureaucratic language of scientific reports. There were the papers from the 1930s outlining the study's non-treatment protocol. There were the mortality reports from the 1950s and 60s. And there was the report from the 1969 review panel, explicitly recommending the study's continuation. There was no ambiguity. The crime was documented by its own perpetrators. On the morning of July 25, 1972, Jean Heller's story broke. It appeared on the front page of the Washington Star. The next day, it was on the front page of the New York Times. The headline read, "Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The story was a bombshell. It exploded across the nation and the world, provoking a firestorm of disbelief and outrage. For the American public, the news was sickening. It flew in the face of the nation's image of itself as a bastion of progress and equality. The civil rights movement had reshaped the country, yet here was evidence of a government-run, racially motivated medical atrocity that had been operating in secret for 4 decades, continuing through the tenures of 7 presidents. The comparisons to the Nazi medical experiments, the subject of the Nuremberg trials a quarter-century earlier, were immediate and unavoidable. But for the men in Macon County, the survivors of the study, the news was something far more personal and devastating. They learned the truth not from a doctor or a nurse, but from reporters who descended on Tuskegee, or from neighbors who had seen the newspapers. Charlie Pollard, a sharecropper who had been a faithful participant since 1932, was one of the first to be interviewed. He was 66 years old, his health failing. He learned the name of his disease for the first time from a reporter. He was told that the bad blood that had plagued him his whole life was actually syphilis, and that a cure had existed for decades. He was told that the doctors he trusted, the men who had given him aspirin and tonics and driven him to his appointments, had been watching him die. His bewilderment and pain were captured in news reports. They said it was a study, he told a journalist. I don't know what they were studying. All I know is they were taking my blood. The sense of betrayal was profound. The trust they had placed in the government, in Nurse Rivers, in the very idea of medicine, was shattered. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts convened congressional hearings just weeks after the story broke. The nation watched on television as high-ranking officials from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, the parent agency of the PHS and CDC, were called to testify. They stammered. They equivocated. They tried to defend the study with the same tired rationalizations about the scientific value of the data and the supposed harmlessness of withholding treatment in the late stages of the disease. But in the glare of the public spotlight, these excuses crumbled, revealing the rotten ethical core of the project. One of the most powerful witnesses was Dr. J. Katz, a professor of law and psychoanalysis from Yale, who laid out the myriad ethical violations in stark terms. He spoke of the lack of informed consent, the active deception, and the moral bankruptcy of prioritizing data collection over human life. Under the intense questioning of the committee, the official defense of the study collapsed. Within months of Heller's article, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs officially ordered the Tuskegee study to be terminated. After 40 years, the death watch was finally over. Of the original 399 infected men, only 74 were still alive. They were immediately offered medical care, including courses of penicillin. But for many, it was too little, too late. The disease had already done its irreversible damage. They were old and sick, many suffering from the tertiary symptoms that the study had been so eager to document. The legacy of the experiment was also passed down. Wives had been infected, and some children had been born with congenital syphilis. The study's data had living, breathing, and suffering consequences. In the summer of 1973, a civil rights attorney named Fred Gray, who had previously represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., filed a class-action lawsuit on behalf of the study's participants and their families. He sued the United States government for $1.8 billion. The government, facing indefensible evidence of its own wrongdoing, chose to settle. In December 1974, a settlement of $10 million was reached. The living participants would receive lifetime medical benefits and burial services. The money was divided among the survivors, with the syphilitic men receiving approximately $37,500 each, and the heirs of the deceased receiving $15,000. The members of the control group received $12,500. It was a pittance for a lifetime of suffering and betrayal, but it was an official acknowledgement of harm. The reverberations of the Tuskegee scandal went far beyond the courtroom. It forced a national reckoning with the ethics of medical research. The congressional hearings led directly to the passage of the National Research Act of 1974. This landmark legislation created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The Commission's work established the ethical principles and guidelines that now govern all government-funded research involving human subjects in the United States. It codified the requirement for informed consent, ensuring that no one could ever again be enrolled in a study without being fully told its purpose, its risks, and its benefits. And it mandated the creation of institutional review boards, or IRBs, at all research facilities. These boards are now the frontline watchdogs, tasked with reviewing and approving any proposed study to ensure it is ethically sound and that the rights and welfare of its participants are protected. The entire modern framework of research ethics in America was built upon the ashes of the Tuskegee study. For more than 2 decades, however, one thing was still missing: a formal apology. The government had paid a settlement and changed its laws, but it had never officially said, "We are sorry." The survivors grew older, and their numbers dwindled. Finally, in the 1990s, a campaign began to secure a presidential apology. On May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton hosted a ceremony at the White House. 5 of the 8 remaining survivors of the study, frail men in their 90s, were in attendance. In a voice filled with emotion, President Clinton spoke directly to them. He said, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It is not only in remembering that shameful past that we can make amends and repair our nation, but it is in remembering that past that we can build a better present and a better future. We can't be afraid to look at the dark places in our history. That is how we find the light." He turned to the elderly men and said, "What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry." Herman Shaw, one of the survivors, then 94 years old, stepped to the podium to respond. He said, "We were treated unfairly, to some extent like guinea pigs. We were not pigs, we were human beings. His words, simple and profound, captured the fundamental sin of the study, the dehumanization of its subjects. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male is now over. The lawsuits are settled, the apology has been issued, and the laws have been changed. But the story does not end there. The anatomy of this particular crime is not just in its 40-year duration or its ghastly methodology. It is in its legacy, a ghost that still haunts the halls of American medicine. The study confirmed the deepest fears of many African Americans, that they were expendable in the eyes of the medical establishment, that their bodies could be used for experimentation, and that the institutions sworn to protect their health could not be trusted. This legacy of mistrust is not an abstract concept. It is a measurable phenomenon, sometimes referred to as the Tuskegee effect. It manifests as a reluctance to participate in clinical trials, which hinders the development of treatments for diseases that disproportionately affect the Black community. It shows up as skepticism toward public health initiatives and a higher degree of distrust in doctors' recommendations. It is a rational response to a historical trauma. When a government proves itself capable of such a profound and prolonged betrayal, the trust, once broken, is exceedingly difficult to repair. The crime committed in Macon County was insidious because its weapon was not a gun or a knife, but a lie wrapped in the authority of science and the promise of care. The perpetrators were not simply a few rogue doctors. They were part of a vast institutional culture that saw Black bodies as fundamentally different and less valuable. A culture that allowed scientific curiosity to eclipse basic human empathy. The study's records show generations of physicians, nurses, and administrators who participated, who saw the data, who knew about the withholding of penicillin, and who chose to do nothing. They were ordinary people who became complicit in an extraordinary evil, demonstrating the terrifying capacity for cruelty that can exist within a bureaucratic system when its moral compass is lost. The men of the Tuskegee study were told they had bad blood, a vague and shameful diagnosis. But the bad blood was never in them. It was in the veins of the institution that exploited their trust, the doctors who valued data more than lives, and the nation that allowed the suffering of its most vulnerable citizens to continue in silence for 40 years. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.